All right, let's dive into a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, Operation Linebacker 2. You might know it as the Christmas bombing. Imagine this. Picture it. December 1972, the holiday season. But instead of, the usual festive cheer, there's this terrifying roar of B-52 bombers over North Vietnam.
Yeah, really stark contrast, right? I mean, it's a moment that just, really captures the whole tension of the Vietnam War. At that point, peace talks had stalled. Nixon was under immense pressure to end U.S.
You
involvement.
promised to get us out, right?
Exactly. And this massive bombing campaign, targeting Hanoi and other key cities, it was a gamble, a huge gamble.
It was like trying to force their hand.
Yeah, basically trying to bomb them back to the negotiating table.
We're talking 20,000 tons of bombs dropped in just 11 days. I mean, it's just an incredible show of force. But was it effective? That's what we're going to look at.
Yeah, and the sources we have, they give us a really fascinating look at both sides of this story. Not just the big political picture, but the human stories, the experiences of those who were actually there.
And that's what we're all about here, right? Getting into the nitty-gritty.
Absolutely.
So on the American side, we have Captain Bob Certain, a B-52 navigator, and his story is, well, it's pretty incredible. His plane was shot down on the very first night of the campaign.
Wow!
Yeah, can you imagine having to eject over enemy territory, not knowing what's going to happen?
I mean, talk about a nightmare scenario.
And the thing is, Certain had doubts about the mission from the start.
Really?
Yeah, he questioned the tactics. They were flying these huge B-52s, these massive bombers, in single file along these predictable routes.
So basically making them easy targets.
That's exactly what he thought. He was like, this is crazy. We're sitting ducks.
And he was right. Tragically right.
His story just really highlights the risks, the human cost of this whole operation. But then we also have the perspective of Dinh Van, a commander in the North Vietnamese air defense.
So the other side of the coin.
Yeah, he was tasked with defending against these, technologically superior B-52s, and he was using Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles.
So talk about an uphill battle. I mean, how do you even begin to defend against that kind of firepower?
It seems almost impossible.
It does, but you know what's remarkable? Dinh Van and his team, they actually managed to score some victories.
They did.
They did. They had to be incredibly resourceful, studying radar patterns, waiting for those brief moments when the American jamming technology would falter.
Just looking for any cracks.
Any opportunity to exploit. And they did.
So it wasn't just a one-sided American air show, huh?
Not at all. The North Vietnamese, they put up a fight.
That's incredible. I'm eager to hear more about how they did it.
Oh, there's some amazing stories. Like on the third night of the bombing, they actually anticipated the American flight patterns and coordinated their attacks, and they managed to shoot down 6 B-52s. Six B-52s. Imagine the shockwaves that sent through the American military.
I bet. I mean, that's got to make you rethink your whole strategy.
It did. The U.S. Strategic Air Command, they had to reassess. They realized they couldn't just rely on brute force. They had to adapt and adapt quickly.
So what did they do? Did they change tactics?
They did. That's what we'll get into next.
Yeah.
Yeah, they shifted from those, predictable flight paths to something called saturation bombing.
Saturation bombing.
Yeah, picture this. A massive wave of bombers, over 110 of them, all approaching Hanoi from different directions all at once.
Wow.
This was on December 26th, and it completely overwhelmed the North Vietnamese defenses.
I can imagine.
They inflicted significant damage, but, this kind of tactic, it definitely sparked outrage back home in the U.S.
Oh, I bet. By that point, the public was pretty much against the war, right?
Yeah, public opinion had really turned. And, those images of the bombing campaign, the rising casualties, all of that just fueled the anti-war movement even more.
Makes sense. People were tired of it. They wanted it to end.
Exactly. And there were protests everywhere, Times Square, college campuses, you name it.
It was a big deal. This was all over the news.
It was. And the media, they were really critical of the bombing, putting a lot of pressure on Nixon.
He was in a tough spot, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. He was caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, he wanted to force a resolution in Vietnam, but on the other hand, he was facing all this unrest at home.
That a dilemma.
It was. And the sources really paint a vivid picture of these protests. Like in Times Square, there were thousands of people blocking traffic, chanting ceasefire and Nixon is a liar.
Wow, that's powerful.
It was a huge demonstration. And then you had editorials in major newspapers like the New York Times openly questioning the morality and the effectiveness of the whole bombing campaign.
Yeah, at that point, a lot of Americans were probably wondering, was this really the path to peace? Or was it just, a desperate attempt to salvage a failing war effort?
That's the question a lot of people were asking, and, it's a question that historians are still debating today.
Is there a clear answer?
Well, it's complicated. On the one hand, just a few days after that massive bombing raid, North Vietnam did return to the negotiating table.
They did.
Yeah. And then on January 23rd, 1973, a peace agreement was signed. Nixon announced a ceasefire, the return of American prisoners of war, and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam.
So it seemed like, at least on the surface, a victory for Nixon. He had fulfilled his campaign promise.
Right. It appeared that way. But if you look closer, did the bombing really achieve its intended goal? Did it actually bring about a lasting peace?
Good question.
That's the crux of the issue. The peace agreement was signed, but the underlying conflict, the conflict between North and South Vietnam, that didn't go away.
It didn't just disappear overnight.
No, it didn't. And the fighting continued. And just 2 years later, in 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese forces.
So the war just kept going even after the U.S. left.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what was the lasting impact of this whole Christmas bombing? What did it actually achieve?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some argue that the bombing was necessary, that it was a show of force that brought North Vietnam back to the table and allowed for the release of American prisoners.
Right, I can see that argument.
But then others contend that it was brutal, ultimately futile, that it caused immense suffering and failed to achieve a lasting peace.
So two very different viewpoints.
Yeah, it's a complicated legacy for sure. And I think sometimes what gets lost in all of this and the big narratives of war and diplomacy are the individual experiences, the human cost.
Right, the people on the ground, what they went through.
Exactly. We've talked about Captain Certain, but the sources also highlight the experiences of ordinary Vietnamese people, the civilians who were caught in the crossfire.
Like the people in Hanoi.
Yeah, imagine being a civilian in Hanoi during those 11 days. The sources describe this constant fear, air raid sirens going off all the time, families hiding in shelters, homes and buildings being destroyed.
Chaos.
It was. The psychological toll must have been immense.
I can't even imagine.
And, the impact didn't just stop when the bombing ended.
There's the aftermath to consider.
Exactly. The sources talk about the long-term consequences. Rebuilding, the trauma, the unexploded bombs that were still a danger long after the peace agreement.
It's a reminder that the true cost of war, it goes way beyond the battlefield.
It does, and sometimes it's the smaller details in the sources that really drive this home. Like, there's one account that mentions a North Vietnamese air defense commander, and despite all the pressure he was under, he found a moment of peace just watching a sunset.
That's beautiful in a way.
It is. It's like amidst all the destruction, he still saw the beauty of the natural world.
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, right? Finding hope even in the darkest times.
It does, and I think it underscores how important it is to remember those human stories alongside the political and military narratives.
We can't forget about the people.
We can't. These individual experiences, they remind us that war isn't just about strategies and statistics. It's about people, their lives, their hopes, their fears.
It's about the human cost on all sides.
Exactly. So as we unpack this pivotal moment, it's clear that the Christmas bombing, it wasn't just about bombs and negotiations. It was about individuals like Captain Certain, like Dim Van, about families trying to survive, about a commander finding solace in a sunset.
It's about the human element, the stories within the larger story.
It is, and I think by understanding those individual experiences, along with the political and military context, that's how we can truly grasp the complexity of this event and its lasting legacy.
It's not a simple story.
It's not. And this deep dive, it's raised some important questions. Did the Christmas bombing actually achieve its goals? Was it a necessary evil, a brutal but effective way to get to peace? Or was it a tragic miscalculation, a testament to the futility of war?
Oh, they're tough questions.
They are questions that historians are still grappling with. And I think for our listener, the key takeaway is that history is rarely black and white.
There's always more to it.
Always. It's filled with nuances, with different perspectives, with unintended consequences.
It really does seem like even after all these years, the Christmas bombing still has people talking.
It does, doesn't it? It really shows you how powerful history is, how it can make us question things, rethink the past.
Thinking about it today, it's almost more relevant now, isn't it? I mean, we see conflicts all over the world. We're still asking these questions about military force, about how to achieve peace.
It's true. The lessons from back then, they still resonate. They remind us that military actions, they have these ripple effects, consequences that can last for generations. And finding peace, well, it's rarely a simple process.
Not at all. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. Imagine yourself back in Hanoi in December of '72. The city's under attack. It's almost Christmas. What are you feeling? What are you hoping for? It's powerful to put yourself in the shoes of those who are there to really understand the human cost of conflict.
It is. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about the lives that are changed forever by those events.
The Christmas bombing was a major turning point in the Vietnam War, a moment of intense military action, political maneuvering, and just human drama.
And as we've seen, it still raises these big questions about the use of force, the challenges of peace negotiations, and the long-lasting impact of war.
This deep dive has given us a look into this pivotal moment, but really it's just a starting point.
Yeah, the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. I encourage you to keep exploring, to read more about it, to consider all the different perspectives on this controversial chapter in history.
There's always more to learn, more to uncover, and by doing that, we can gain a better understanding of the past and how it shapes the present and even the future.
Because in the end, history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we take away from it, how we use those lessons to build a more peaceful, a more just world.
Well said.
That's all for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.